people will demand these items that are produced by themselves. So aggregate supply of goods and services will determine or will create its own demand. And if there's no demand, then they believe that this will, or if there's less demand, they believe that this will cause the price of the goods to come down and society or consumers benefit. But the Keynesian, when they observe the situation of the collapsed economies in 1930s, they saw high unemployment and recession as the key challenges. And Keynes, this school of thought what follows a British economist called John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes said that the problem about the economy for which it was slumping or for which it was growing, it was not growing, or it has recession in those days, was because there was no demand. There was not enough demand to bring about supply. From the perspective of Keynes, he believes that it is what the individuals or households are willing to demand, that is what the firms will rather produce. So the firms should not produce that, there will be demand, the production will create its own demand. But rather, the demand should emanate from the households, and based on that demand, then the firms will produce. And therefore, the Keynes school of thought on public finance is that it is necessary to include government in the demand side of the market, aggregate demand side of the market. And therefore, the equation AD equals C plus I plus G becomes the case. In the case of the classical, they will just say aggregate demand is equal to the demand coming from the households, which we call consumption, and then the demand coming from firms, which we call the investment. C for consumption, I for investment. But if you follow the Keynesian, then G is also important. G is important because they believe that government can adapt to the aggregate demand side of the market and thereby increase demand so that firms can produce more. And once firms are producing more, they have to employ more labor. And the more labor they employ, the more output they keep producing and demanded by households. And at the end of the day, you see that the problem of high unemployment and recession, that was the problem of 1930s, will be solved. So Keynes made a strong case for government activities, government intervention, not only in the market, but in the business of production of goods and services. So, for instance, if government intervenes in the economy by providing a need, let's say the people of La, or the people of La, or the people of Mungwa, or the people of how do we call this place? Let's say the people of Labadi, the people of Labadi need a hospital. Government decides to intervene because the market fails, assume the market fails in that direction. And once the market fails, government says, okay, I want to provide. This activity is going to create demand, which will be added to the aggregate demand side of the market. How will it create demand? Like I told those of you who read monetary economics last semester, if government decides to build that hospital, what will happen is that the project will have to go through the procurement process. A contractor will have to win the contract, and then that contractor is going to demand certain goods or raw materials to build a hospital. For instance, for the hospital to be built, the contractor has to buy cement, has to buy sand, has to buy iron rod, has to buy water, has to buy labor services, has to buy skillful services like architecture and some of that, have to buy services, have to buy many other raw materials and skills. And in the end, you see that purchase of all these things will require more production. For instance, if the contractor decides that for this project, we are going to spend 1,000 bags of cement, then it means the cement producers will have to employ additional hands to produce maybe extra 1,000 bags of cement to supply to the contractor who is coming to build the hospital. And this will create demand, and the demand will be met by the cement manufacturing factory. And in the process, the cement manufacturing factory will need some labor, and therefore, as they employ more, then this phenomena will reduce the high unemployment. So Keynes make the case that if government is creating demand, if government is in the economy, the government will have to survive, will have to live, and the very survival and its livelihood will make them to spend resources, and this expenditure creates demand, and this demand is met by the firms, and the firms employ more to meet the demand and therefore reduce unemployment. And as they employ more to produce the cement, you see that what they produce also become output, and this output will help solve the downturn in economic output or will solve recession problem. So you see Keynes trying to address the failure of the idea that aggregate supply will create its own demand has resulted in a strong case for government to spend on the economy, for government intervention. And once government intervenes, government has to buy A4 sheets for operations. They have to take on various hands to make decisions as far as public policy is concerned. And all these activities will create demand in one way or the other. And at the end of the day, you expect that the demand created will be met by firms. Firms have to employ more people to be able to increase production or meet the demand. And the more people they employ, the lower the high unemployment becomes. So this is what the Keynesian understanding of public finances, that government intervention is necessary to shore up or to increase aggregate demand, which will motivate the firms in the economy to produce more to meet this aggregate demand. And to produce more to meet the aggregate demand, they need to employ more. And as they employ more, they are solving the problem of high unemployment. And as the people they employ also produce, they are solving the problem of recession, where output, the macroeconomic output of the economy also grows. So that is the perspective from the Keynesian theory or Keynesian school of thought. So, for instance, you might have heard about, those of you read monetary economics last semester, we talk about two kinds of policies, the expansionary and then the contractionary. So also is the case that if you look at the school of thought that associates with the Keynes analysis, We can also extend the analysis and say, okay, in this case, we can accept the classical fact that the economy will self-correct. But the question is, what about if it takes eternity to self-correct? Then it means the economy would have collapsed by then. And this was the situation in 1930, where everybody was waiting on the market forces to self-correct the downturn and in output, and therefore that couldn't happen, and this led to collapse of many economies worldwide, which we call the 1930 Great Depression. So if the economy will not self-correct fast, then it's also a case for government activities if this can help to make the economy self-correct. So if government intervention can bring about the economy to readjust to get optimal outcomes, then Keynes believed that this is necessary to solve the combined problem of high unemployment and a slow production of goods and services, what we call recession. So for expansionary government activities, we can carry this kind of activities on when we have recession, output levels are very low. So government intervention will be to carry out expansionary government activities. Expansionary government activities here means government can decide to intervene in terms of building hospitals, schools, schools, and all these projects that government will embark on when it intervenes in the market or when it comes in the business of the economy will cause more demand. And this more demand will force firms to produce more, thereby employing more. Then also there can be situations where we have what we call inflationary boom. Inflationary boom comes on during the period where the economy is not able to produce much. The economy is not able to produce much, but the levels of expenditure or willingness to make expenses is very high in the economy. If that happens, then we'll be talking about inflationary boom. And inflationary boom is a situation where we can say there is much willingness to buy, but the goods are not there. The willingness to buy is people have income that they want to spend more and more, but the goods on which to spend them are not there. So in the end, more money will begin to chase fewer goods. And this is what we call inflation or inflationary boom. So in the case of inflationary boom, the government can intervene through contractionary activities where it reduces its expenditure so that the output level will reduce and demand will reduce. Or government can come in to reduce taxes so that private individual or firms can have some liberty or some breather to produce more. That is the tax aspect. But if it is inflationary boom, then more taxes will come in so that this can increase the cost for business and firms, and they will produce less. And the less they produce, the more it is able to match up with the inflationary boom so that we don't have very high inflation. So if you produce less, and you are able to supply same to the country, you'll be solving the problem. Or even the increase in taxes is also going to serve as a disincentive to produce more. And sometimes the increase in taxes takes money directly away from the hands of households so that there will not be more money chasing fewer goods. It's a case of the proposed e-levy, for instance, is going to take money if they are able to bring it on. It will take money directly from people and reallocate it to government. So if government decides that I want to tone down the level of expenditure, government can simply increase the taxes, take the taxes and use them for something else that does not end up causing inflationary problems. So that's the school of thought of the Maynard Keynes. Just as I was explaining that the Keynesian believe that government activities may induce the economy to self-correct if it is unable to produce optimal outcomes. So it is the case that the Chicago School of Thought also makes us understand that it will be this government intervention could make sense more or less if minimal, and could also be important where its intervention is meant to improve market efficiency. So the Chicago School is saying if government will intervene in the market at all, government intervention must improve market efficiency, and therefore makes the argument that if governments or public sector intervention in the economy will not improve market efficiency or market outcomes, then there is no need for government intervention at all. They premise most of their ideas on the fact that if government intervenes, government may come through with taxes, for instance, and taxes usually bring about economic inefficiency in that it creates what we call deadweight loss, or it creates inefficiency for the economy. And this inefficiency is what we refer to as deadweight loss. So if you are not careful and government comes in and does not improve market outcomes or market efficiency and also introduce tax, then you see that the situation will be worse off, because the taxes will mainly create also deadweight loss in as much as it helps government to increase revenue. So these are the three kind of school of thoughts on why government should intervene in the market, although there are other reasons why the intervention will make sense. But for these three schools of thought, these were some of the ideas on which they base government intervention. Somebody want to ask a question?
The Chicago School of Thought. We didn't see your screen.
Please, I can't hear you.
We didn't see your screen when you were explaining the Chicago School of Thought.
Again, please, I can't hear you.
So she said you are not sharing
Please,
your
you were not
screen.
sharing your screen.
Uh-oh. It's not me, it's the screen itself that went. There is a, okay, let me redo it and see how it works. Has it come now?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. So basically, the Chicago School of Thought is saying, okay, government intervention may be necessary, but if government intervenes, then it must be sure that the intervention will improve market efficiency. Otherwise, there's no need for it. And they make their case because taxes introduce inefficiency. And when government comes in, government will by all means impose taxes. And therefore, if through its activities, it doesn't improve market outcomes or market efficiency, then there is no need for it. This is the school of thought we call the Chicago School of Thought. Are you able to see the slides still?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Good. So let me pause for some 5 minutes. And if you have some views, some questions, you can ask so that we discuss what views or questions or comments that you want to make. I pause for 5 minutes. No, 5 minutes is too much. Within 2 minutes, if nobody opts up, then we continue. But if somebody has a view, comment, or question to ask, I'm ready to listen to you. Keynesian makes a strong case. The Chicago School of Thought kind of accepts but makes a condition for which government intervention is necessary, and they believe it must improve market outcomes. If you don't have any question for me, I have to ask you one. Based on these perspectives, which of the schools of thought apply more and more to developing versus developed economies?
Sir.
Yes.
So with the developing economies, the Keynesian school of thought applies more, and I think with the developed economies, the Chicago school of thought applies more there.
Yeah, you are right. For instance, if you look at the US is kind of torn between the classical and then the Chicago School of Thought, but more Chicago. And therefore, in the US economy, government intervention is only necessary to provide legal and regulatory frameworks, and when necessary, to help improve market efficiency. That is why, for instance, in the US, it's hard to be going on strike. Why? Because the market is what determines labor services more and more. So the number of hours you work is the amount of money you get. So there is no hard and fast rule about it. If you want more money, work for longer hours, including overtime. But in developing economies, because of the possibilities that we don't have the possibility that the market often fail, we tend to more or less follow the Keynesian school of thought. And also because of the development gap. The development gap is very wide in developing countries. And therefore, government intervention in one way or the other will be necessary to provide public goods, i.e. roads, hospitals, schools, and many other social economic infrastructure, or what we call enabling infrastructure. And this enabling infrastructure will help grow the economy. And through that intervention, you are solving two problems. One, you are able to get the enabling infrastructure. And two, as government creates demand, this demand is met by firms to employ more. So for instance, if government expends to build roads, the people who are employed to build roads will be counted as a reduction in unemployment. So you see, for developing economies, there is this double benefit that you get the infrastructure, and then also through the process of building the infrastructure, you are solving indirectly the problem of unemployment and to some extent downturn in output. So you are right. Good. Let's continue. Please, are you able to see the next slide? Okay. Now,
No, sir.
thank you. Now, for public finance, as I've explained already, is pivoted on the idea that we should resort to the market mechanism for efficiency. But where the market tends to fail, government intervention might be necessary. So there are instances or conditions under which the market works. There are conditions under which the market also fails. And public finance tries to find out situations under which the market can work and the situations under which the market does not produce optimal outcomes. And if the market does not produce optimal outcomes, then it is important that government intervenes. And some of the reasons why government can intervene when the market fails happens to be in the case of public goods. Public goods, for instance, once they are provided, you cannot stop somebody from consuming them. And therefore, because you cannot stop anybody from consuming them, it will be difficult for somebody to pay for it. And if they are not going to pay for it, which private entity will be interested in producing a public good where people are not willing to pay for it because you can enjoy it for free? Unless you are a Father Christmas or you are an NGO, you can't do that. If you are for profit, it's not possible. So that should tell you that in the case of public goods, the market can fail. Then also in the case of externalities, externalities are situations where the production and consumption activity of somebody, a private entity, produces either benefits or disbenefits to others, or a third party, sometimes some texts will say bystander. So for instance, if you are in my neighborhood and assume that somebody decides to recruit the services of private security, you see that the fact that that security man sits in front of the person's gate is also providing security to the opposite or neighboring neighbors indirectly. Why? Because if that person sits there, his eyes are not only on that particular house, because he's going to be looking around to see is anybody coming from elsewhere to come and attack that house or to fly over the wall. So you see that at the end of the day, the people around, though they are not paying for the security service, they are also enjoying the security being provided by that one person. This is externality. We call it positive externality, a benefit that is derived without paying for it, when somebody else is paying as a private good or as a private service that the person is paying for. The same way, it can be negative, where, for instance, a firm produces something at one place, and what it produces becomes a hazard to people who live in the neighborhood. So in the neighborhood, you have people falling sick because maybe they allow dirty water from the production of the goods or from the firm to go through the gutters and give some stench, and this stench can cause health problems for the people who live in the neighborhood of the factory. This is a negative externality. In this case, the firm should have been compensating the people around who are suffering the pollution, but because the firm is not going to compensate them, there is a cost. This becomes a cost to the people who live in the neighborhood, and that is what also is a negative externality. We have other types of externalities which we'll look at in depth. All these aspects of the course, we are going to take them one by one as a topic, as I've shown on the course outline. Then we also have information asymmetry. This can also be another reason for government to intervene in the market. Information asymmetry can have some characteristics of public good and sometimes some characteristics of externalities. For instance, if information flow to a particular entities yield external benefits for which payment is not made for such information, then this becomes information asymmetry that generates bad market outcomes. For instance, if let's say Joy News is facilitating a training program for some group of people and they put it live on TV, you see that those people that are in their premises or wherever going through the training, they are the direct benefits, or they have the direct private benefits from this. But somebody in his house who is watching TV could also benefit from this without paying. So you see that the information flow or information asymmetry can bring about some benefits or disbenefits. Sometimes also, if information doesn't flow to reproduce optimal outcomes, it will be necessary for government to intervene. For instance, if they are carrying out immunization. And this information does not get to people. They may not get their children immunized. And this becomes also later on a negative externality, because a child that is not immunized will be can transmit diseases to the other colleagues when they play together. Some of those communicable diseases can be transmitted just by playing with somebody who is infected. So information asymmetry also makes some case, not strong always, but sometimes makes some case for government intervention. The other one is what you call increasing returns arguments, or what you simply term as situations of monopolies. There are certain goods or services for their production involve huge initial capital. The sunk cost is very high. And therefore, private sector or private market may not be in a position to raise that huge initial capital to produce such services. In that case, we say there is increasing returns to scale, or there are situations of monopoly. Example is the production of water. The production of water requires huge initial outlay and can only be produced in bulk to make the required benefits. So in this case, you realize that it makes sense for government, for purposes of monopoly or increasing returns, to show that this huge initial outlay to make sure that water is provided. Besides, water provision or provision of water being a necessity can also be taken as a security issue. So sometimes government, in the mindset of seeing this as a security issue, will have to produce it so that they can have control over it. Imagine a private entity producing water for the whole country, and that private entity is not getting enough returns, or is not being able to have its way to make more money. And therefore, that private entity colludes or colludes with an enemy of the state to cause water to be cut off for the whole country. That's a typical security issue. So it is also for electricity. So energy generation also requires huge initial capital outlay. So oftentimes it is government that take that up, because they have a broader shoulder to be able to withstand this huge initial capital necessary for such goods. And sometimes we refer to this as natural monopolies. They are not monopolies by cartels or monopolies by collusion between firms to restrict output like OPEC does. But they are natural monopolies in that, because they require huge initial capital outlay, it proscribes the private sector immediately, because the private sector will find it difficult to raise that huge resources to be able to spend on just one project that wise. So for a very long time, our energy sector, for instance, in Ghana, was under the tutelage of the government. So government often the one sole producer of this energy, until recently, where we face acute energy problems, and we decided that let's try and see if we can get strategic. Let's try and see if we can get somebody's might be an echo. So they try and see, please, the one whose microphone is on, put it off. So until recently, when we faced the energy crisis, the government then went into some strategic partnership with the private sector to be able to generate energy. So we have now the independent power producers. They produce, but not even in bulk like that of the government. And many of these independent power producers have to also rely on foreign investment bodies for funding. And some of them, they have to provide the machines for them so that they pay them later as and when they start generating energy. The issue of capacity charges, which became one of the political talk points some time ago. So these and many other reasons which we'll talk about in depth along the way makes us to see government intervention necessary, usually when the market fails. But we have to also recognize that government intervention may also not work in as much as the private market do not work, or the private. For instance, the property rights. At a point, it will be necessary to sell property rights to people so that the market can be efficient. For instance, the example of a company producing, let's say, drinks for which they dispose of dirty water into the drains can be resolved by proper assignment of property rights. In this case, government can come in and set regulatory framework and say people who live in the environment in which this company disposes of dirty water into the gutters and you suffer health hazards, we are telling you that we have assigned a property right to the gutters, the property right of the gutters to you. So you have this right. Anytime the company disposes of wastewater into the gutters, you enforce the right by either making them to pay for the disposal into the gutters or to make provision of what they call a CSR, corporate social responsibility infrastructure, to take care of or to compensate one way or the other for disposing dirty water into the gutters. So sometimes firms that see this and are socially minded, even if government does not come in and say we are selling property, we are giving property rights to the people to enforce so that you pay them for the pollution, the firms that are socially minded sometimes go and put up a hospital in the area as an intervention, recognizing that because property rights were not assigned, they are making intervention to take care of the harm they are causing you as a result of disposing of some level of pollutants into your gutters. So property rights, when well defined, can help us also improve market outcomes. And this is what you see some major institutions in those advanced economies advance more and more. For instance, in the US, we have the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act, for instance, gives some property rights to some individual to enforce that firms do not actually pollute the air beyond certain limits. So these kind of things can help to especially ensure environmental sustainability. So sometimes it is important to also talk about such issues. So concluding statement as far as some of these discussions are concerned is that market mechanism alone, I'm reading the two bullet sentences. Market mechanism alone cannot perform all economic functions. That is, we cannot rely on the market mechanism to give us optimal outcomes always. Public policy is therefore needed. Public policy is about government intervention. So we say public policy is therefore needed to guide, correct, and supplement the market mechanism in certain respects. And those respects are what will engage our attention in the course of the semester as we go through the various mechanisms by which the state intervention becomes very important. All right, so there we go. We can proceed and look at other ideas about the overview of public finance. The another one is that it is worth to note also that though the market may fail, government intervention might not necessarily resolve market failures because of what we call government failure. Government failure is a situation where we say, yes, market has failed. Government intervention is necessary to resolve some of these market inefficiencies or market suboptimal outcomes. But government intervenes and the intervention does not resolve the problem, does not resolve the market failure. Sometimes it even worsens it. In that situation, we say we have market failure. Oh, sorry, we have government failure. We have government failure. So there are a number of things that can make the government fail. And sometimes things that make the market fail could also make the government fail as well when it intervenes. Example is the determination of preference. For instance, as we'll see later, when you do public good analysis, one of the ways of resolving that problem is for everybody to review that for this particular public good provided, I have dissatisfaction from it. So if Kwesi says, okay, my satisfaction for providing street lights in front of my house is 20%, or let's say 30%, then another person say, oh, mine is 10%. Another person say, oh, my satisfaction is 50%. You see, these percentages, they have different valuations of the street light that has been provided. So it is based on these valuations that you can extract the amount people should pay as a contribution towards provision of the street light. But individuals have different satisfaction or preferences or valuations of public goods. For instance, if a street light is provided in front of your house, if you are security minded, for you, your valuation of that street light is going to be high. So if they say, pay this amount for it, you may be willing to pay for it. But the same street light for which you value very highly because you are security conscious, or you think that it has helped your vicinity to be lit, this same street light will be for a thief or a robber or armed robber. This security light, he will value his presence maybe at zero. Why? Because for him, it doesn't satisfy him at all. When the security light is lit, he will not be able to carry out his nefarious activity of stealing. So for him, if you say pay 10 or pay a peso for that street light, that person will not even pay. Because for him, the valuation of the street light is almost negative for him, because he doesn't enjoy it, that it doesn't provide him a service that enables him to achieve such kind of nefarious objectives. It's a bad example, but it's just for the sake of example. So in that case, you have that kind of situation. So later on, we'll think about how we can address public good situation, public good market failure situations through government intervention and or through private solutions. And we'll discuss some of these things in depth. But situation, there are some factors that can make the market fail, and those factors can also make the government fail. But particularly when we talk about market failure, there are certain factors or certain dispositions that lead to government failure as far as public finance is concerned. Some of them include the fact that we can have rent-seeking behaviors. Rent-seeking behavior. I don't know whether you have come across this term before. Rent-seeking behaviors. Rent-seeking behaviors. When we talk about rent-seeking behaviors, please, are you able to see the slide? Because I've made some changes somewhere. Please, are you able to see the current slide?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. So when we talk about rent-seeking behaviors, we are talking about behaviors in which now, you know, if you say public intervention, public sector activities are manned mainly by political parties who spearhead governments. And sometimes the process of raising funding for these parties makes it sad that you have to fall on cronies, friends, families, and business tycoons who have latent benefits that they are earmarking. Some of them, when they get into these positions where you have to take public sector actions to correct market outcomes or to improve the economy by solving situations of market failures, they think that it is payback time. So some of them take contracts, and the required interventions necessary to be done to bring about the desired correction for the market failure will not be done. Sometimes they are done at suboptimal levels. They don't produce the items to the point where we say there is value for money. And therefore, you see that government intervention may not necessarily, in that case, address the market failure. A case in point, we said that for this course, we are going to make examples from the Ghanaian environment. A case in point is the story being told about the wife of some powerful politician, so businessman, who contributes to a certain party very well, given a contract of 100 million to provide and install street lights, and the number of street lights installed cannot be said to match up with the 100 million that was given to that politician's wife. So you see, street lights is a typical public good, and therefore the market will fail in providing that. And now an intervention is being made so that we can do that, and somebody gets the money and thinks this is payback time. And he or she, let me say he or she, I don't want to, some of you may be guessing, so I just want to give the example. I'm not a politician, so I don't want to mention anybody's name. He or she may think this payback time, and for that reason, the number of street lights that are necessary to match up with the value of 100 million will not be provided. So you see, the market fail. Government intervention to address this failure in providing street light has also failed due to this rent-seeking behavior. Closely linked with rent-seeking behavior is corruption. Corruption where people do not regard value for money. Sometimes they take some money for this item, they don't provide the item, and recent phenomena is that what we witnessed recently is that politicians will tell you, oh, the thing has been done. They'll post pictures on digital platforms. When you check and then you check the ground, you not see anything. Then they come back and tell you they are digital icons. And some of these things, you see that they are only contributing to government failure. Yes, you took money, you say you are doing this and that, and at the end of the day, the thing is not produced. And you'll be hearing about this PIAC, Public Interest and Accountability Committee, the one that polices the management and the use of the oil revenue. More often than not, when they do their audits, the projects that governments say they implement with oil fund, they take the time to go to the sites and go and check the project they have outlined that we have used the money to do this project. When they go there, sometimes the project is non-existent. A case in point recently we heard in the news, in one of the towns, they say they have built market. When you go there, no market exists. And all these will make government intervention fail to improve market outcomes. Another case is where we have government monopolies. This one we can't blame government so much, but it's more or less a natural monopoly situations where government is the sole provider of some of those services. You see that those services that government intervention is supposed to help provide the framework or the requirements that to make the market produce better, they are not able to deliver. So at the end of the day, government intervenes, but the market does not produce typical optimal outcomes. A case in point is where you have production of a national ID card, for instance. People took money. Sometimes the monies are not accounted for. Sometimes they say they are producing cars, they are doing this and that. At the end of the day, they will do it, and then you have to go another time, they come back again, come and do it again. For instance, SIM card registration. This is supposed to make sure information flow in the economy is good, so that based on information, market can allocate resources optimally. And the ID card situation has turned into something else. You have to register and then go and queue again and register. And we don't know, we are going to queue again and register. And you queue here, you register. You queue there, you register. You queue there, you register. Tomorrow, Senate will come, queue and register biometric. Electoral Commission will come, queue and register biometric. NCA will come, queue and register biometric. Telephony networks will also be compelled to queue us and register us again. The same person. How many times should we register before you can synchronize data, for instance, to make sure you get a very good national register? And based on this, the market can fall on it to allocate resources efficiently. For instance, banks need this kind of data to be able to identify individuals so that they know the extent to which they can allocate financial resources to XYZ firms to make sure that they help or they allocate resources efficiently so that we get optimal market outcomes. So when it happens like that, you see situations of moral hazard and adverse selections cannot be solved by this kind of interventions that are necessary to correct the adverse selection, which is a situation of what we call information asymmetry. So some of those things are prevalent in the economy. Then the last one is, or there are others which you can think about and bring out, but we can also talk about agency problems. Sometimes our citizens, our social contract is with the president. We vote for a president, the president delegates, we give him our power, he's our principal, we are principal, he's our agent. He also delegate the power to another agent, and this agent sometimes maximize goals that are different from those that we have assigned them. A case in point is our typical Ghanaian parliament, where when it comes to voting, they are supposed to vote according to those people they represent, what they feel, their aspirations, and etc. But when they get there, they ignore the people altogether. It is all private aim of either putting my party up or putting some party down. And you see the optimal outcome, which will help correct the market, which will help improve the market outcomes. It's not realized at the end of the day because of these differences in the motives. Whereas the principal is looking up to something, the agent is doing something else altogether, based on another objective altogether. So if you have these kind of situations, government intervention will not necessarily resolve market failures. We can continue. And the question is, why are government activities or interventions common in developing economies? Somebody answered that question already. But because market failure situations are more and more prevalent in developing economies than developed economies. And therefore, we see the need more often than not for government intervention or public sector activities in developing economies than. It is on the basis of this also that the international financial institutions often give grants, loans, and etc., special drawing rights to governments of developing countries to be able to make the right intervention so that sometimes this can improve market outcomes. But oftentimes they know the government failure situation as well. So this age, what many of these international financial institutions or donor community do is that they ask you to take a private entity that will deliver this or that, and they sometimes deal with the private entities directly. A case in point is the building of the Kwame Nkrumah interchange at Sekel. Was it the Brazilian government also that gave us the fund? And when we were about to enter into the loan, because they know some of these situations, they said a contractor from their country has to do the construction, and therefore the payment is made directly more often than not to the contractor for work done, and they are able to monitor to make sure that the loan and the fund goes into the production of the item or the infrastructure that it is earmarked for. But unfortunately, recently we haven't done some of those things where we earmark loans, for instance, for capital investment projects, so that directly we know for this loan that we have taken, it is this particular project the loan is working on. So at the end of the day, once the loan comes, especially this situation of securitizing sources of revenue to get loan, once the loan comes, they add it to the consolidated fund. They say it goes to budget support. At the end of the day, they use it to do build story buildings in the stomach. And we don't get anything to point to that, oh, okay, for this particular loan that we have taken, this project is what the loan was used for. and any revenue streams that are generated from that project, we can use it and juxtapose that with the cost that we have expended on that project and say, okay, we are making some returns. We are trying to get some benefits from that project. So these are some of the basic ways by which you say that government failure is real, especially in developing economies. So government intervention does not necessarily improve market outcomes, especially in developing economies. I am going to pause for another 5 minutes and take your views, comments, or questions on what we have discussed so far. And then I can proceed to run up with the rest of the items. If you don't have any question, if you have one, just unmute yourself and then you let us have your view, your comment, your suggestions, or your question if necessary. Just unmute yourself and talk if you have an issue. Hey, so all that I've said, you don't have a view or contribution, just to make it a bit interactive. Okay, it seems as if you want a typical lecture, so let me just do that for you and go. Because if a typical lecture there, I don't have any problem. I can talk about everything quickly and then we go. But if it's not a typical lecture that you want, but you want us to be interactive, then unmute your microphone and contribute. Every view is a view. It's normative that I'm asking for, not positive. So give us some ideas or your comment view on things that we have discussed so far. Okay, if there's none, let me proceed. Or you can type your question in the chat if you feel shy to write, if you feel shy to speak, as you say. Now, I want to talk about tools of public finance analysis or so. In public finance, or economics in general, we talk about positive analysis and normative analysis. The positive analysis usually is about what must be. So if you are doing analysis, you are discussing public finance issue, what must be is positive analysis. For instance, we know in our basic economics that when price of goods go up, demand will go down, or quantity demanded will go down. This is a positive analysis because it doesn't depend on your biases. Irrespective of how you see it, anytime price of a good goes up, the quantity demanded for that good will go down for normal goods. Positive analysis. If the good is inferior, when the price goes up, the quantity may go up for inferior goods. This is positive analysis. So these kind of statements, when you make them, when you are doing public finance analysis or public policy analysis, we say you are doing positive analysis. It's objective statements. They are statements that we can say are valid, either by theory or by pure observation or scientific analysis. And for this positive analysis, you can usually use models that are based on established theories to explain them. For instance, what I'm telling you is one of the economic theories where we say when demand goes up, when demand goes up, it means price might have gone down, or when price goes up, demand for a good quantity demanded will go down. But normative has to do with what ought to be subjective. Subjective biases, subjective views are all included in there. One of the issues that usually regard normative analysis in public finance is the issue of equity or fairness. We'll see it later. So we ask the question, for instance, is it fair to make people pay the same level of taxes even when they don't earn the same income? Is it fair? Those kind of statements are more or less subjective. They are normative analysis kind of questions. So normative ones has some biases in it. These biases may result from either political ideology, either the kind of upbringing one has, or the kind of training and education level that one has. There is something we call bounded rationality. It is not everybody who can hear or have some information and process it to get the greatest benefit from it. So it depends on your ability to process information. And some of these things all determine the extent to which one is normatively biased or normatively unbiased. The third kind of tools that we deploy for purposes of analysis are typical economic theory. There are many economic theories that we can draw on from economic theory to analyze public finance issues. Some of them include demand-supply analysis. We know demand is willingness of people to pay for a particular good. Supply is willingness of producers to put such goods on the market for sale. For every person that wants to demand, the person has a reservation price, which is the maximum amount the person is willing to pay for that good. For every supplier too, they have a reservation price, which is the minimum amount of money they are willing to take to give out a particular good for sale or to somebody who is in need of it. At any point in time, if they engage in bargaining, negotiation, and they settle on a price and a quantity, then they are supposed to earn some kind of surplus. And this is what we call consumer surplus in the case of the consumer or demand. So for instance, in this diagram that I've drawn with red ink, point A is the reservation price for somebody who wants to demand a particular good. So this is point A is the amount is willing to pay at the maximum. Point B down here is a price that the supplier is willing to accept. Go accept at the minimum. But if the demand and supply forces interact and allocate resources, then a certain unique price like P star here and Q star here will be arrived at. So you see, the consumer is willing to pay the point A, but the market allocator that is paying the price P. So this region, the triangle here, is called the consumer surplus. So it is also that the supply is willing to only accept B, but under minimum B. But after the market forces allocate resources, now the producer too is getting this region as surplus because the price he wants is this, meanwhile he's getting this. So it's higher than what he wants. This one, the maximum he could pay is this, but he's also paying P. So this side, there is a surplus here. This is called the producer surplus. This is called the consumer surplus. Later on, we'll use this tool to do analysis about the circumstances under which the market is efficient. Yes, I pause again for a minute. Any question, view that we want to express? Anybody who wants to give us his or view or ask a question, you can please unmute yourself and ask. Feel free to also type your question if you feel that's a better platform for you to ask your question. I'll try and read it and answer. Okay, in the absence of any question, I move on. When government intervenes and set certain objectives for itself or perform certain functions in the economy. And these objectives are three. One is stabilization of the economy. Two is equitable distribution of income. Three is growth of the economy. Sometimes the objective goes to also include employment generation. So some texts will also talk about economic growth and employment generation. So these are some of the objectives. Macro stability, macroeconomic stability means at any point in time, the economy may have a boom or have a recession. Boom means that the output level of the economy is growing up and high. So recession means the output level of the economy is going down, down, down. So this fluctuation between boom and recession happens in the economy. The government will set objective that if these fluctuations goes on in the economy, it will be difficult for businesses to invest because businesses don't like the uncertainty that is associated with economics. It makes it difficult to invest when you can't plan because the market dynamics pose uncertainty to you. So government objective may be to stabilize the macro fundamentals. And for these macro fundamentals, they happen to be associated with various markets that form the macro economy. For instance, the market for labor, we talk about wages. The market for finance, we talk about interest rates as price. The market for foreign currency, we talk about exchange rate. The market for goods and services, we usually say prices, and etc. So for you, if you are able to stabilize the economy, then, and these prices of various markets stabilize, you see that you'll be able to the environment becomes more enabling for production purposes. Because if there is some level of certainty in the economy, it is easy for businesses to plan and be able to produce more. So government will set the objective to ensure some macro stability in various markets that form the macro economy. We also have equitable distribution of income, and government set objectives that make sure that the rich does not necessarily become richer, whereas the poor become poorer. Rather, if it's possible and it's practicable and can be done through policy, we try to redistribute some amount of wealth or income from the rich to the poor. And this redistribution can come in the form of subsidies on some products. It can also come in the form of provision of public goods using the bulk of tax revenue from the riches to produce these public goods for the poorest of the poor to be able to also come up small or to be better off some way, somehow, socially. So we can use both taxation and subsidy schemes and public good provision and etc. to ensure this equitable distribution of income. Economic growth and employment is also important, especially for development purposes. And if you grow the economy, you happen to get more revenue, because as the economy grows and people are able to sell more and make more revenue, then they can pay higher tax on profit as well. And the public sector or the government will also get more tax revenue. Employment too is necessary, especially when employment is more or less a security issue in many developing economies. So you have to set objective to grow the economy and to ensure employment. And these objectives can be set by the government, and often set by the government through some intervention programs. For instance, the current government in the previous term was carrying out some NABCO recruitment, etc., etc., etc. This is a public policy objective to make sure that they reduce unemployment or they generate employment for the youth and others. Except that when recently they were celebrating our 6th March, the people were carrying the flags and placards for the NABCO people look to be people who are in their menopauses. So one wonders whether it's still the people that they call themselves NABConians or who else. But now let's proceed. For government to achieve this objective, it usually set up a number of functions. And these functions include what we call allocative function, for instance. Allocative function. And the allocative function, we are talking about government trying to make allocation of goods and services, distribute goods and services. Usually, what you see is that the government will be interested, the public sector will be interested in getting some social mix of private goods and social goods to ensure maximum consumption. And it is the allocative function that helps us to be able to do so. And when it exercises the allocative function, it usually leads sometimes to provision of public goods. Provision of public goods. And for more reading on this allocative, distribution, and then stabilization functions, you can read Musgrave and Musgrave 1989, chapter 1. The books I sent you, one of them, I think the second one or so, chapter 1. You have some good reading on these functions that the government take on. So, for instance, if you talk about the allocative function or allocation function, you realize that Ghana's middle income class is growing rapidly. This has resulted in a lot of cars that you see in Accra, to the point that now, if even the motorway, Tema motorway, there's traffic in the morning on the Tema motorway itself. So this is private good, the cars. But for optimal consumption of this private good, for instance, it will be necessary for government to select certain social mix of private and public to optimize this. So, for instance, this situation calls for more allocation of resources towards building of new roads or expansion of the old ones. And this is where allocation function of the government comes in, to be able to identify the sectors of the economy where there is need to make provision for social goods, so that we have a certain mix of social and private goods to bring optimal consumption or optimal satisfaction. Then we also have the distribution or redistribution functions. Here, the interest is in making sure that we reduce income inequality substantially. So in the distribution or redistribution function, it will be necessary to try and see how can we mobilize some resources or some funds from the rich or the affluent and use these same resources to make some improvement in the life of the poorest of the poor, or the people who are in the lower income brackets. This is redistribution or distribution. And government does this through a number of schemes. Sometimes they do it through subsidies. So, for instance, as we are struggling now, there is crucial need for government to mobilize some resources and do redistribution so that there will be some subsidies for LPG. So the poor and people more and more can use LPG in order also to save the environment. So if government decides to come with some subsidy for LPG, for instance, it will be a redistribution activity. They can also do that through charging or imposing progressive taxes. Progressive taxes are taxes that are imposed so that people who are rich or richer pay more than people who are poor. So such progressive taxes can help for these redistribution functions to be carried out by government. Then the stabilization. As I was telling you, for every economy, at one point in time, there can be a boom or there can be a recession. But these fluctuations in the economy and in the prices of various markets within the economy does not help investment. It makes things uncertain. And therefore, it will be in the interest of government to make sure there is some stability in the economy, not only to make sure the welfare of the people are better off, but also for international ranking and international analysis and international scheme of things. Like the vice president used to say, when in doubt, look at the exchange rate. So you see that some of these macroeconomic fundamentals are supposed to be stabilized. Once they are stabilized or they are stable, it gives the impetus to the business sector or the entrepreneurs or the investors to be able to invest more, because they can plan, and then through planning they can make sure that they make good investment to grow the economy. And these functions that government takes on as its economic functions or objectives are carried out mainly through the budgetary process. And the budgetary process is the process where they sit down, do the analysis, pick projects that are of priority to them. These days, you can't say to the people, because more or less things that they do, some of them, you don't see them making any serious impact on the welfare of the masses. So they plan this through the budgetary process, and then they incur government expenditures, revenues, and make sure they fashion out policies to carry out these functions. Of course, these are the functions explained once again, but the allocative function will look for government allocation process by provision of social goods, such that we can have some mix of social goods that go with the private goods. The distribution function involves adjustment in income so that to be in conformity with what we say is fair or just by the society. And this will involve the role of taxes and transfer policies, taxes, progressive taxes, transfer policies like subsidies. Stabilization function, we use the budgetary process to make sure we maintain high employment and price stability, even as we try to make allowances for the economy to grow. Distribution function, I explained to you already. But to say that if you leave distribution to the market mechanism or competitive market, distribution of income will depend on factor endowments, factors like land, labor, entrepreneurial skill, and etc. These are factor endowments. So if you possess the factor endowment, if you own it, it is then that you are able to get the compensation that is due to using these factor endowments. So if you leave distribution, for instance, to the market will distribute such that people who have rights to these factor endowments will become richer and richer, whereas those who have no right to these factor endowments will become poorer and poorer. So there is need for some redistribution or distribution function of the government to make sure that there is some socially acceptable income distribution threshold that can ensure that society to some extent has some minimum level of livelihood that we can write home about. And government does this function through tax transfer schemes like subsidies for low-income households, use of progressive taxes where people who earn more pay more, or combination of the two, where we use some taxes on goods we impose taxes on goods consumed by high-income people and use the resources as subsidies for those who consume certain goods that are low-income level or for low income consumers. And this may have efficiency concerns, but it is worth discussing it. And we'll discuss that the efficiency concerns as far as redistribution is concerned when we come to tax analysis or taxation. Stabilization function, as I explained to you already, also seeks to ensure we have high employment, we have growth of the economy, and there is some level of stability. So when you have situation of high unemployment and high inflation, then there's need for stability seriously. And government does this stabilization of the economy through public policy, making sure that they use fiscal policy and monetary policy instruments to bring the desired level of growth of the economy. We learned this under the monetary economics, where for fiscal policy, they can use taxation and or government or public expenditures to bring the desired direction of output in the economy and or employment situation. They can use the monetary policy instruments as well to mainly often to ensure they are able to achieve goals or objectives that are associated with inflation and those kind of inflationary dynamics or hyperinflation, high inflation in the economy. So all these are necessary for government intervention. So, of course, I've explained allocative already, but one issue in public finance that is worth considering also is the situation of what we call equity. What is equity? Equity is a social construct which examines fairness in distributing resources among the population. So we look at, is it fair to redistribute income from those who are wealthy to those who are not wealthy? How is income distribution, wealth distribution, distribution of opportunities, and even public projects supposed to be done to ensure we have some fairness? Do we need to do cost-benefit analysis? Yes, sometimes we do cost-benefit analysis to ensure that we can make a scientific justification for those projects. So equity means we should be treating people fairly in terms of resources, in terms of opportunities, in terms of income distribution. So government tries to ensure equity or fairness through its activities such as taxation and provision of public goods. So taxation, for instance, when they tax the high income brackets and they pay more, and these amounts of money are used to as tax revenue to maybe provide public goods for low income earners. That's a typical case of trying to ensure some level of equity. And for equity's sake, there are two concepts that equity usually talks about when we talk about this equity analysis. The first one is the benefit principle. To ensure equity, and as far as taxes are concerned, we say the benefit principle must be applied. The benefit principle says people who benefit from government activity must pay for it, must pay taxes, higher taxes. For instance, if government provide street lights in your vicinity, in your neighborhood, it is only fair because you are going to benefit from it. You pay street light levy, or you pay levies that are associated with street light to be able to pay for them, or to acknowledge that you are benefiting from the street light. It would be ideal to identify communities where street lights have not been provided, so that they don't tax them or they don't pay any extra on their electricity bills as um, towards street lights. It will also be necessary to identify communities when street lights are provided. So they tax them some little extra to pay for the fixing of the street lights when they go bad, or for maintenance, I should say, maintenance of the street lights. This is what you call the benefit principle. There is also the ability to pay principle of equity. And the ability to pay principle of equity says that people who have the capacity to take on huge financial burden should be made to pay more. If you have the capacity to pay more, you should be made to pay more. And how can we identify that you have the capacity to pay more? We can look at your income. We can look at your tax returns. We can look at your assets. We can look at your properties and identify that you have the capacity to pay more. For instance, where I live, you pay rent about 1,000 Ghana cedis a month. And the painful thing, as we all know, is that they will tell you to bring 2-year advance. But when the municipality bring taxes for the house to be given to the landlord, and they pay per annum 500 cedis, sometimes 400 cedis per annum. It used to be 400, now 500 cedis per annum for a whole year. Whereas the income being generated through the rent is supposed to be 12,000 cedis per annum, and you are paying 500 cedis. What percentage is that? So you see, if we apply this ability to pay principle to the housing sector, the real estate sector, and we are able to identify property owners, and we charge them appropriate taxes, we could fix our economy easily. But these are not easy solutions. So our politicians are always looking for the low-hanging fruits, like e-levy. There are two types of equity that we sometimes talk about. We have horizontal equity. Horizontal equity says to ensure fairness, equals must be treated equally. Equals must be treated equally. That is horizontal equity. And guess what? The vertical equity says that the unequals must be treated unequally. So we have the horizontal equity, and then we have the vertical equity. So for horizontal equity, for instance, it says people who earn, for instance, the same amount of income should be taxed the same, or should be subjected to the same kinds of taxes. And vertical equity says that unequals must be treated unequally. That means people who have different levels of income should not be taxed the same rate of tax. That is why people are told to to file their tax returns, because as a university, for instance, two lecturers may receive the same pay because they are on the same rank, but one may have other sources of income, whilst the other may not. So in this case, if you tax all of them at the same rate, you are not ensuring horizontal equity. And it is vertical equity that must apply, that because they are likely to have different levels of income, they should be treated differently. The tax rate that must apply to low-income people must be different from the tax rate that applies to high-income people. And it is a vertical equity that is built into income tax structure, such that we have thresholds. They say from sometimes you hear from 1,000 to this amount, 5%. From this to that amount, 10% income tax. From that point to this point, 20%. From this point, this percent. If it's above this, 25% or that percent. This is applying typically what we call the vertical equity theory, or vertical equity as in unequals must be treated unequally. So we'll discuss some of these things also when we come to the taxation. We'll take taxation as a typical issue, and then we'll do analysis for that for 2 weeks. So we have a lot to talk about as far as taxation is concerned along the way. So the question is, which of these equity types inure to the benefit of the poor in society? Which of these equity types do you think inure to the benefit of the poor in society? Maybe you can discuss that when you have your private studies. So I make the last point that equity should be seen as an end, but efficiency should also be considered. So when we are talking about equity, there is a trade-off between mainly equity and efficiency. So sometimes we say we must be cautious to make sure that this trade-off is managed well. Otherwise, whilst you are trying to ensure equity, you introduce inefficiency into the taxation system. And whilst you are trying to improve efficiency, you may also be introducing unfairness or situations that are not equity enough into the process of taxation or public policy analysis. So these are some things that we can discuss. We have barely 5 minutes, but you can discuss it. You can discuss this as application questions as far as equity is concerned. So look at a number of taxes: progressive taxation, VAT, NHIS, and find out which of them will you say is satisfy the equity principle more. Which kind of equity do you think these taxes achieve? And when we take remuneration, such as the single spine salary structure that was implemented and is still implementing now, the Article 71 political office holders remuneration, allowances, and securities, social security. You can look at all these remuneration schemes and see whether they satisfy equity. And then which kind of equity do you think they satisfy? So this will be for your discussion during your private studies. Somebody want to ask a question?
Yes, sir. That's me. Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you, please.
Please, I wanted to ask a question based on the slide before this one. Yes. So here, the first one talking about the horizontal equity, and you're saying that people doing the same work must receive same salary according to their rank. So what if maybe like we have 2 companies?
My friend, please, hello.
Hello.
Let me correct you. I didn't say that. I say equity here says that people earning the same salary, for instance, must be taxed the same rate. Of course, you can do the same work, but people will collect different salaries. That is normal. For instance, when you come to UPSA, some are lecturers, others are senior lecturers, some are professors, some are associate professors, some are full professors. We all do the same work, which is what lecturing, research, and all that. But they take different salaries. This is not the situation I'm talking about. I'm talking about people taking the same salary and being paid the same tax rate. And if they take different salaries, different tax rates must apply to them. That is vertical equity.
All right. Thank you, sir.
I'm listening.
All right, sir. I've gotten it.
Have you got the answer from what I explained?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay. Any other question from anybody? Okay, so I'll urge you to go and read Musgrave and Musgrave chapter 1. It's not too long in the textbook I sent you. If you are unable to read it at all, go to page 14. They provided a summary there. Go through the summary at least.